Introduction. Good evening, anyway. Good evening, or good morning, whoever may be listening tomorrow or right now when the podcast is being recorded here on Wednesday evening. My name's David Young. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane up in Cairns, North Queensland, and tonight we have a special guest of Phil Cassell, who is a civil engineer up in the northern area of Queensland and has been for 40-odd years. He's held board positions on many industry groups, including Civil Contractors Federation, North Queensland Civil Construction Association, PwC Skills for Australia, and has been on reference groups for the Chamber of Commerce up in this area as well. He's obviously a civil engineer, also has branched into education with accounting and environmental management, and is currently studying law. He's been a huge advocate for local government procurement acts and all sorts of building industry fairness acts and workplace health and safety legislation. And also with us we have Bill Bates and Matt Maloney. So welcome, gentlemen, and special welcome to Phil Cassell.
Good evening.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Phil, let's start with you because you've taken the time to share with us your Wednesday evening, so thank you for that. With your experience in North Queensland civil construction, I believe you even went to the extent to start one of your own associations to lobby for the industry in this area. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, that's right, Matt. We originally were part of another organisation that was Queensland-wide, but the same, predominantly based in the southeast corner. And I served 5 years with that particular organisation and on the board and as their regional chairman. And it was just the old case of we thought representation in the regional areas was dipping off, and so a group of us got together up here and we decided to start the North Queensland Civil Construction Association. That's been running, I think, just over 2 years now. It does have a great membership base already in those few short years. It's designed around three particular areas. One obviously is education and, continued training. One is joint ventures and alliance, working together type initiatives. And the other one, of course, is our political advocacy. So that's probably the area we've been most successful in is political advocacy. But again, we can approach our local guys, but how much weight that actually carries south is always the unknown.
Yes, well done for taking that initiative because from previous conversations, and it was quite a while ago now, I remember you saying that the membership grew quite rapidly as well when you first started that organisation. Was that correct? Obviously, lots of civil engineers in the northern part of Queensland recognise the disparity of jobs going to more southern contractors.
It was, and basically we started here around Cairns, then we ended up drifting the Port Douglas Mossman, then we ended up drifting south to Townsville. Then all of a sudden we found ourselves as far south as, I think, Rockhampton or very close to it, as far out as Mount Isa, right up to the Torres Strait. So the area that we actually represented was quite a significant portion of rural and North Queensland. So, of course, when this group had a particular industry body that they knew was purely dedicated to, best construction procurement and practices in those regions, they simply came on board. They saw value in having a voice.
Well, and all the more reason for government contracts of any magnitude that if they can, they should use local contractors. And it's great that you made that association to be able to band together with other medium or smaller civil construction companies to be able to bid for those larger jobs. So well done, mate. But obviously, Southern Contractors coming in to reap the rewards of projects that might otherwise be only for the benefit of regional Queensland is a bit sad on every front, really.
It is, and we're seeing some sort of scenario that I don't have accurate data on, but some sort of scenario now playing out with the convention centre here in Cairns, which is one of the major redevelopment or construction projects. And we've seen all week that the there's two sides to the story. One side says we're local contractors and we've been excluded in a probably a legal way, but maybe not a moral way in, our opinion up here. But then we see that in the newspapers a lot of big contracts have gone again down south. So we really shake our head about what governments are truly committed to, regional areas. And I suspect this is right across Australia, not just here in Queensland. But once you get out of those epicentres of the major city and we often wonder if we're really considered. And I guess it comes down to representation in Parliament. We're allowed one representative for so many of the population. The higher population density areas get a lot more. Bill, you'd probably be able to help me with the state member numbers here if you could, please.
Yes, well, after the last redistribution, when we moved from 89 seats to 93 seats, and we got another 4 seats in southeast Queensland. Not only did the number of seats increase, but we also had the quota of voters per electorate go up from 29,000 per seat to 33,000 per seat, and that's the midpoint of the quota, and you've got about 1,000 on either side of that to qualify for a state seat. So it's interesting to note that from 1989, Central North Queensland had 24 seats in the 89 seat Parliament, which was the first year of the 89 seats. So we had 27% of the representation in Brisbane was from Central and North Queensland. With the last redistribution, we've now got 17 seats in a 93-seat Parliament. So our representation in Brisbane Parliament is now down to 18%. And the real scary thing is we were due for another full redistribution in 2024. And because Brisbane is growing at least at twice the rate of regional Queensland in population, it's expected that another 560,000 voters are going to have to be brought into the voting list and adjusted around. Like when we go to this election at the end of this year, all they'll do is shift the boundaries around a little bit to even them out a little bit. But they won't actually consider additional seats. But come 2024, they will. And we could see a situation where we go from 93 seats to, say, 98 seats, because you've got to fit another 500,000 voters in. And we will be struggling if we can retain our 17 seats. There's a good chance we'll actually go down because our population hasn't been growing as fast as the southeast Queensland. So they'll get additional seats, and we may actually fall. And that's the scary thing, is our diminishing representation down there.
Well, I guess that's what you touched on as well, Phil, wasn't it? Is when it comes to representation and the clout in the Parliament to ensure that more localised contractors are undertaking the work in their area of expertise. It's, I suppose, when 17 people north of Gladstone, Rockhampton area, which is a split vote between Labor, Liberal and Katter Party anyway, and even Stephen Andrews, our One Nation counterpart, their One Nation counterpart, I should say. I suppose we can't adequately expect those 17 representatives to ensure that more localised procurement will actually take place as well.
Well, that's right. We can't ensure it. I mean, we can, to some extent, ensure that they accurately represent us. But, it's no good taking a knife to a gunfight, is it? Sending 17 representatives down against the balance of 93, are we really throwing our committed local members, to the line, so to speak?
Especially when these larger...
I guess
sorry, Phil. Continue, sorry.
All right. Continue.
Yeah.
I guess the only way we've really, got the attention of our local politicians in the regions that we move in, and that's at all levels, local, state and federal, is to link their listening ears to budget. to jobs and budget. And that's about the only way sometimes we feel that our organisation gets that that representation is by presenting a case that's economically viable for them to make it very difficult to say no.
Mm. Yes, and when Southern contractors win these, as far as I understand, win these contracts, they can't necessarily justify the expenses in logistics anyway, and to be on par with otherwise what would be their bid, it seems only logical to, even if it was at a slightly more increased rate, local contractors should win out every time, but that's not obviously happening. So,
well, it goes back to the procurement policies call for 5 different criteria. One of them is economic and social benefit to the region where the project is. One of them's best value for money, and I believe there are a lot of councils in regional and North Queensland that really abide by that. The issue we have, though, is we know what we're up against here in far North Queensland, for example. We know what the environmental conditions are. We know what the economic conditions are. Now, a classic example is if I want to fix a particular machine here in North Queensland, for example, I can't just go down the road and buy the spare part, and if he doesn't have it, go the other side of town and buy the spare part. I've got to wait for those spare parts to come all the way up from Brisbane and freight and time down. So all these impacts go to, I guess, the cost of doing construction business in a remote or far north tropical area. Fuel, for example, 20, 30 cents a litre, sometimes cheaper down south than we buy it up here. So what happens is we do get competition, and we're not afraid of good, honest competition. I don't want your listeners to think that we want jobs just handed to us. We want to win them fairly and honestly, and in the best interests of the industry and the community. And so when they put their price together down there, it's easy for an out-of-town contractor to understand all those impacts that you could have 2 weeks of rain. You have to set everyone down. You can't work. And so they price it, I guess, under the economic and environmental conditions that they're used to. And that comes out sometimes significantly cheaper than those that are from the region and fully informed about those aspects. And that's where the problems start then, is that it doesn't matter where the contractor came from. You have a public infrastructure project that has a contractor from wherever who will struggle to meet his obligations under contract for that dollar value. So again, it's not only that do our...
Are you there, Phil? I've lost audio on Phil.
Oh, you're fucking kidding. I'm not.
Oh. Are you there, Phil?
Oh, sorry, are you still there?
Yeah, we heard.
Oh, great, wonderful. I thought I dropped out.
Wrong time.
Continue, mate.
Whoops.
Yeah, continue, mate.
My apologies. Yeah, good one. So I guess getting back to those conditions, not only do our contractors locally miss out on the work, and subsequently the margins that allow us to pay those people when they're during the wet season, but the community misses out because there's now a compromise between what the job should be and what the contractor can potentially afford it to be. So it's a double whammy in some cases, not all cases, but when that occurs, and then it's a big flow-on effect from there.
I guess one thing I'd like to touch on as well is, and it's not to give you any comfort at all, Phil, but from talking to many a bricklayer and a carpenter and a roofer and a plumber, it's a rampant problem in every industry, and anything to do with construction, and especially those industries that predominantly circle around government projects, because they're usually the largest of any kind of construction that's happening. Usually. Losing out to southern contractors is becoming such a problem that local contractors. I was only speaking to a plumber a few weeks ago that says that they, under the contracts, the terms, they can stipulate that all this work that they don't actually adequately account for, that a more localised and expertise person of expertise in the local area would understand, like you just laid out, Phil, can add it onto the bid afterwards anyway. Is that correct in the civil engineering sort of contract form?
Look, it is possible, and that does occur in some circumstances. If the contracts are set out clearly and they're not ambiguous in their intent or their direction, it shouldn't, unless there are what we call latent conditions. So we say let's build a road through the bush there and down. All of a sudden they start to build the road, but they find that there's a lot of hard rock or something underneath the ground that wasn't discovered during the time of tender or of letting the works. That's a latent condition, and yes, we do sometimes need to deal with that. Wet weather can sometimes be a condition that slows the job down, but doesn't necessarily allow a claim for cost during the period of the wet weather, and sometimes that can be the biggest risk. Is that, for example, we've just had a few weeks of rain right in the middle of winter. So that 3 weeks of rain has a pretty severe impact on our civil construction industry that we're aware of and we can allow for. But, we've had contractors from the most arid state in the most arid country in the world, being South Australia, come to the wet tropics and they see 40 millimetres of rain, and they worry, and we say, well, wait until you get 400 millimetres of rain. So there's some of the issues that, dealing local and keeping it, within the region, fairly significant impacts on the overall, state or federal budgets.
I can imagine a project manager of that magnitude a few weeks into a couple of month contract going, oh, I know why we won this one.
Absolutely, and believe me, I'm speaking on historic events there, not hypotheticals.
No, that's of course, and there's a couple of examples of road being laid out in the Tablelands area, which is exactly attesting to what you're talking about. And one wet season down the track, it's washed away because it wasn't adequately laid. Might be to a specification, and that's one thing, but nothing's more destructive than a huge body of water, I'm sure.
Well, that's certainly true in some extent. What is a greater impact, though, is the lack of infrastructure. I guess everyone listening has a fairly good idea that a great amount of the state-generated income is from regional and northern Queensland. Now, to give you a quick example, is we build a river tunnel. That's great, but for that sort of money, we could be building some major cattle routes for the cattle trucks, some major transport routes for, the sugarcane and other produce and things that we have up here. We could be developing a port for our seafood industry. And now, the issue we have there is we need to make it attractive for people to come to regional and remote areas to work. It's not always about money, because they rattle their trucks down a dirt road, they simply break all the suspension. And that's tens of thousands of dollars. So if we were to build this infrastructure, if we had the money and the representation to build this infrastructure and present that to, to say competitors in the transport industry or competitors in the fishing industry or the refrigerated transport industry or whatever it is, whatever industry, agriculture, that type of thing, all of a sudden now we start to develop satellite points of business. So, Mariba, for example, might develop a big truck centre up there because a lot of the trucks congregate there because there's beautiful roads to get up into the Cape and wherever to get the produce or the whatever it is that we're transporting. All of a sudden that creates a better pool of competition, which creates a better outcome for the consumers of those products. So straight away we start to see a roll-on effect from better infrastructure projects in our region, because we do produce so much. The trouble we have at the moment is we don't have the representation to necessarily draw that attention and those economic benefits not only now locally, but we're now talking about economic benefits to the state in return for their investment in our regional infrastructure. Now, I don't understand personally why that isn't a priority. We're talking about shorter food and world food famines and all that sort of thing. Why now are we not tooling up for a future market that would benefit the state overall, and obviously the flow into the federal government, and that's above our local governments and our local communities. We start to delve into a lot of people benefiting.
Yes, you hit a lot of nails on the head there, Phil. There was a couple of great points, but I guess the predominant thing as well is when it comes to infrastructure, the representation is what's going to make sure that infrastructure is spent adequately in the areas it needed. And like you said, if a trucking company had a $50,000 decrease in their amount of maintenance on their trailers on simple things like suspension, it's only going to reduce the amount of economic cost down the end of the line, and like you say, to the consumer. But with that lack of representation, which, I mean, everyone's still, lots of people are still not turned to the idea of the creation of a new state, but we wholeheartedly believe that by creating that new state and ensuring that the representation is localised, we can ensure that money goes towards the things like ports and roads that only benefits economically the whole of Central and North Queensland. But it's not going to happen when we only have 17 representatives out of 93, and it's not going to happen unless we create a new state. Bill, what was your thoughts on some of Phil's comments there?
Well, I'd just like to take up a couple of points in regards just on contractors and that. I dealt with defence contractors for years and years and years, and sometimes we always knew that we had a cheaper bid come in, and there was a criteria that made us sort of wary of that, but there were rules depending on the amount of money expended. We had to take that thing. But the people also knew that most governments run on a contingency basis. So they work out a project cost, and then there's a contingency, and it runs to about probably maximum 10%. And so a lot of businesses actually knew that they could come in and do a project at a certain cost, knowing that for some reasonable circumstances that they could get the additional cost out of the government later on by simply putting in an amendment, and the government, because it was within that range, didn't penalise the contractor in any way. So there's those sort of things where sometimes companies do take a chance on coming in a little bit low with the expectation that there's a contingency factor that they can call upon to get them that extra bit of money. The other thing is, it's interesting what Phil was touching on in regards to what the spent on infrastructure and how it benefits the state and the nation much greater, because spending infrastructure like in Central Regional Queensland is usually infrastructure that adds value and creates wealth. Whereas you look at the Cross River Tunnel or rail, it's a $5 billion project that's probably going to run $8 to $10 billion by the time they finish it. And what it does, it saves about 8 to 10 minutes on commuter time, and those commuters on the rail, they're not earning anything for the state. Every trip is subsidised by at least $11 or $12 by the taxpayer anyway. They don't even pay the actual cost of the journey. It's actually all subsidised. So that $5 billion spent into that tunnel is not going to generate any revenue for the state or the nation. Whereas the $5 billion project, say, to improve the Kuranda range and grow the efficiency of transport of agricultural goods from the tablelands down to the Cairns port or the airport, that adds wealth, as does building a dam and putting in irrigation to improve the quantity of agriculture, both in variety of product and and the extent of the amount you can produce. So I think that's one of the biggest things about large spends in regional Queensland. It will actually generate wealth.
That's a fantastic point, Bill. And I guess, Phil, that comes to a question. And Bill pointed out that when you have I think it is the largest project that's currently underway in the Queensland expenditure for projects. What could just $6 billion do to the infrastructure and increasing the economic value of central and North Queensland? Like, for example, Bill mentioned the Coranda Range. It's long been discussed that the Coranda Range is well due for an upgrade, if not a completely new access to the Tablelands area from the Cairns area. The Gillies Range, south of Cairns, is no better than the northern ranges in the whole of Australia. But what could $6 billion do? I mean, it could adequately build another range to surpass Coranda and the Gillies Range, could it not?
Oh, undoubtedly, $6 billion could get us up the range. But when we get up the range, what does it do for us then? Are we focusing on getting people from Coranda to Cairns quicker, better, faster, safer, or are we opening up a transport avenue that can take us from Cairns all the way to Corumba or to the Cape or to, far out regions where the big cattle stations are? Now, we need to look at, the roads are done, under a cost analysis to see if they're viable for what they're going to produce at the time. So, yes, let's build a new Coranda range. Let's build it for heavy transport. Let's look at the roads beyond that, though, from the top of the Coranda range right through to the transport, I guess, starting points, so to the cattle stations. So we need to upgrade the cattle roads. We need to upgrade some strategic roads. I recently spoke to Robbie Catter, who pointed out a road that could easily be upgraded, and they can get much larger trucks all the way through to, I think it was Dimula or Mareeba, somewhere there. They're the sensible sorts of infrastructure that we need to look at. And it's not always that we're going to move the most people in the quickest amount of time, like the tunnel or the rail in Brisbane. It's what is the best value for money for that piece of infrastructure. Over its life, what will it produce for the people that the road passes through their regions, and what will it produce in state revenue? We have to remember at the moment Queensland's over $90 billion in debt. So we can't afford the luxury of simply building mega infrastructure projects to move, I believe, a great number of people, but 8 minutes really is 8 minutes. They stand there longer than 8 minutes waiting for a cup of coffee when they get to town.
Yes, and the economic benefits to, like you say, if from discussions with local representatives like Robbie Catter and from understanding the local area, that a $500 million spine that goes down the middle of Queensland in the central and northern part could have economic benefits far into the future that would far outweigh an 8-minute transit decrease in time for our southern counterparts. So it's both a sad thought and a nice thought to know that if we had a better representation, we might be able to achieve that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Matt, did you have a thought?
If I could just...
Look, I did have a quick question. I've just got to duck off for a little while, and I'll be back shortly. I suspect you're going to end up answering my question because you're heading into the direction I want. But so yeah, if you don't hear from me, or if I hang up for 5 minutes, I'll be back in shortly.
Okay, well, we'll see you when you're back then. Okay, we'll see you when you're back in. Bill, you had a thought.
If I could just touch on something that Phil just mentioned in regards to we can't do a lot of great things because we've got a $90 billion debt. It's who's we, white man? I mean, that's the southeast Queensland debt. If we leave,
touché.
If we leave, we can leave with zero debt. We don't necessarily have to take the $17,000 per capita when we leave. It's not a part of separation. We leave with all the assets that we have, the fixed infrastructure we got, such as hospitals, roads, schools, bridges. We own that automatically. and we also own all mobile facilities that actually support the state or this region. And that means the ambulance, the fire trucks, the police cars, and all that sort of stuff is all ours. What we don't have to take the debt, because the only debt we have to actually take is debt that is currently being or owed because of some major project going on in our regions. But I just cannot for the life of me think of any multi-billion-dollar project in central and north Queensland that is in progress that we might have to keep funding.
No, I agree, Bill, and I'm glad you picked up on that comment. There's a little bit of bait there for you because your knowledge on those aspects is much better than mine, so thank you for elaborating for me. Now, I got a message through that road I was talking about with the Caterparties, that Oontan Road, and I see here that it's so it can open up for triple road trains. So obviously that's a very strategic and very important piece of infrastructure. That wouldn't be $6 billion, I wouldn't imagine, guys.
But unfortunately, the voter of the more condensed area of Brisbane doesn't understand the economic benefit of allowing for a road to be built for triple trucks. They just, sadly, the voters' thoughts on what should be spent is more inclined to believe that an 8-minute train ride being quicker, being a train ride being 8 minutes quicker is obviously where their thoughts would be at.
Oh, absolutely, and that comes from the density of numbers rather than the need, for the economic benefit of the state. And I guess if if the residents of regional and North Queensland have that economic control, we would probably not worry about 8 minutes getting to work. I think we'd be more in favour of trying to work with those big transport issues and, make the roads suitable for these operators. It's tough enough as it is trying to be in road transport these days. The margins are so minimal. I think the state budget has, I guess, a social and moral obligation to try and work with each and every industry for the benefit, of the residents of the state.
I guess we should mention too that the upgrading and spending of funds on things like roads only has a benefit that far exceeds just industries like cattle and agriculture and primary industries, because, one of the biggest industries to a place like Corumba is the grey nomads, and having the roads safer would only be more appealing to tourists to actually get out and explore the beautiful part of Australia that we live and breathe. So it only makes sense on so many factors.
Oh, it does. If you look at the big picture and the big economic rollout right through to the true end user, I think Bill Cummins from Cummins study on the roll-on effects of infrastructure dollars and industry dollars. Look, I can't remember the exact numbers, but to some extent that money rolled around the economy, 5 or 7 times before it finally ended up in the treasury or in the coffers down in the southeast corner. So it's an incredible roll-on effect that money spent in our region on critical infrastructure or critical industries. It doesn't have to be critical infrastructure all the time. We've got a fishing industry. We've got a
I think it's Bill. Bill, I think your microphone's going haywire again. If you're there, Phil, I think there's something, maybe twist one of the connections to your headphones or something like that.
Sounds like he's twisted something.
Yeah.
Talk out of the bottle.
Yeah.
Don't know what's going on there.
Yeah. Crackle, crackle, crackle.
Anyway,
yeah.
If I can, until Phil comes back, it is a bit of a motorboat. Maybe he's gone fishing. I was interested today in regards to what Phil was saying in contracts and that, and that there's two sides of the story. And we've had Michael Healy basically defend the South East Queensland government's role in the convention centre and delivering for regional Queensland, in the fact that a certain amount of percentage of the workers are going to be from local areas. But it still boils down to the same thing. It's only on the basis of the small contracts or parts of the big contracts that are filtered down to local workers and things like that, but not the actual major part of the contract. Like, the whole thing is worth $176 million. That was the original sort of project cost. But in there's components that are still multi-million dollar components for air conditioning or seating or something or other. And they're subcontracts underneath Lend-Lease's major contracts. And they lease it, and they let the contracts for those suppliers. And what we're finding is Lend-Lease is getting suppliers from Melbourne or that for the air conditioning, and yes, so they win a $4 or $5 million contract to supply components, and yes, some labour they'll employ some labour from the Cairns area to actually do some of the installation under their supervision. So, as Healy's sort of like I think of Healy as our member for breadcrumbs. Like, he's so happy when he gets a crumb off the Brisbane table, and that's how he speaks in regards to defending South East Queensland government's situation with the convention centre, is that at least we are getting something, even if we aren't getting the major contract, the prime contract and the major contracts within that contract.
Yes, and we can be sure that the Minister for Breadcrumbs, like you say, Bill, will be squabbling back to make sure that he tried to make sure that local contractors would win out as promised, but ultimately he doesn't have any real control over it, because when the contract's signed off, you can't unsign it.
Well, that's right. And the other interesting thing is, I mean,
one moment, Bill. Just one moment, Bill. We might just try. If you disconnect and just try reconnect. So I'm just going to disconnect you if you can hear me, mate. And just rejoin the room. Give your headphones a bit of a pull out of the socket and plug it back in. And we'll just see if we come back in with all the problems gone. So just join the room again, mate.
Oh, that's better.
Yeah, so he's here we go. We'll see if his microphone does it a second time.
Hi guys, are you there?
Yes, yeah, it must have just been a connection or something.
It could be. Anyway, I could hear what you were saying, and I agree with it. You're right on the money with the comments.
Just another thing, Phil. Like, we have been talking about the state government's role in our way forward, but we haven't really touched on the federal part. Like, you were saying that you'd speak to state and federal counterparts. The trouble is, you don't have really too many federal counterparts in this region. You've got Warren, then you've got to go down to Bob down in Kennedy, and then the next one further down is Phil Thompson in Herbert for House of Representatives. We've now got Nikita Green living in Cairns, and Susan McDonald in Townsville, and Canavan in Rockhampton. But we all know that although they are members or representative of us, they actually are very beholding to their Brisbane headquarters. And even the senators like Canavan, he's fairly outspoken on on a separate state, a little bit anyway. But he chooses while he chooses to live in Rockhampton, he's not necessarily a North Queensland senator. He is a Queensland senator, and that goes for all of them. So my question to you is, how much access to the federal politicians do you have under your organisation, and how effective are they?
Oh, that's a great question. The two main ones, obviously, in this area would be Warren Inch and Bob Cutter. Both of them easy to get a hold of, easy to discuss issues with. They understand the issues. I think we get good representation from those two members that we've got in this particular area. But again, they're one or two going down to a federal parliament.
In 150.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, their hands are tied, but I'll give them their due credit without playing any politics at all, is that Warren has probably bought $500 million into North Queensland over the last, half a dozen years. It was Warren Inch that got us directly to the Deputy Prime Minister, and Michael McCormack on an issue that was resolved, believe it or not, within a week. Bob Cutter, again, has obtained a lot of funding in his area, but it's two. It's 2 out of 150, and they always say to me, Phil, look, we understand, we'll go down and fight the fight, but again, it's 1 or 2 out of so many that it's cap in hand stuff.
Yeah, that's the problem. But as a separate state, and we have.
I can't hear anyone.
There
you are.
Who's got the music on? Yeah. And the House of Reps can only be twice that as the Senate. So if there was another state, the chances are all the states would go from 12 senators down to 10 senators. But do you think Central and North Queensland would be better served federally if suddenly we had 10 senators going down to Canberra?
Oh, imagine what we could achieve, Bill. That's the whole point. If we had 10 senators, oh man, that's
what
one or two.
That's what statehood delivers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and a lot of people don't see that aspect. Well, I can't.
No, they certainly don't.
Well, it does pretty well for Tasmania. I mean, one senator the stats down there named Landy can get $150 million written off overnight.
I'd love to have that influence in Canberra for North Queensland, undoubtedly. But no, you're right. If 10 senators going down arguing the point, but Bill, let's throw a wild idea out. How much really would a northern state of Queensland, with our wealth, how much really would we rely on having to have our politicians go cap in hand begging for money that wasn't constitutionally designed to come to us in any state? Really, would we need to go and beg for more funds, or would we just do a Western Australia and manage our own affairs to a greater extent?
Well, I think you'd find the fact that the wealth base that we have, we'd be on. Well, we're second in regards to export wealth, only to Western Australia. We'd like to get Bill Cummings on to give us a rundown of all the wealth. But the thing is, if you compare the economies of, say, Central and North Queensland, just our merchandising shipping exports are something like $60 billion. Now, Tasmania's only got a $5 billion export industry. and South Australia a meagre 12 billion. So we're 5 times, the export powerhouse of even South Australia, which has got 1.7 million people. So, we can well and truly take care of those sorts of things. But the other thing is, a lot of people don't seem to realise that the Queensland, a lot of people concentrate on expenditure and what people, what they spend and how much you're going to get. But the real key to a state or how well it's off is its revenue base. And the revenue income for Queensland in total is $42 billion annually. And it's been that figure for the last couple of years as far as the Treasury income goes. But of that $42 billion, over $19 billion comes straight from grants of GST and Commonwealth grants straight into the budget to spend. Now, if we separated, our portion of that $19 billion would be something like $7 billion, because we actually get a little bit more because we've got a very sparsely populated region, and it costs more money to get services to all those people. So the Grants Commission actually works all that out and provides extra money for states like South Australia and Queensland to cover the vast areas that they've got to look after. So we're never going to be short of money to run ourselves.
No, and that's the beauty of it, is we would be entitled to certain federal funding, which is granted under the constitutional grants or whatever. So I don't think our members would really have to go to Canberra, cap in hand, asking for additional funds or special funding for projects or special funding for employment. I think we'd probably be fairly right, wouldn't we?
I don't think we have to have all those caravans to Canberra and go and cap in hand like beggars.
Well, I guess
that they've been doing for
we need to remember gentlemen, that I suppose in the years to come, the economic powerhouse that new state would become in Central and North Queensland would be able to dictate a lot of power when it comes to major decisions, not just in our regions, but the way that the country governs itself.
Well, I think the big thing you would find, there would be a major partnership, I would probably call it, between West Australia and North Queensland in regards to seeing things in regards to how much money you earn and how to drive forward, versus places like Tasmania that sort of have got 520,000 people, yet they've got 12 senators, their own state parliament, and 5 members in the House of Representatives. They've got all that representation, and which gives them a bit of clout to get extra grants in that. And so you've got the situation where they refused to develop, like there was an opportunity there to build a state-of-the-art paper mill for their wood chip industry, but they decided to turn it down because they just wanted to be involved in eco-friendly type sort of stuff. And so they can do those sort of things because of the good graces of the GST redistribution that allows them to sort of, well, we won't do any mining, we won't do any forestry, we won't build any industries, we'll just lift cap in hand. And that situation would change if North Queensland and maybe a few other states came into play, and you wouldn't have things like South Australia blowing up its coal fire station and depending on Victoria to give it a bit of energy and things like that. So I think the big thing that comes from North Queensland becoming a state is you get this moving forward in regards to development and growth, rather than the stagnation that sort of places like South Australia and Tasmania sort of have.
So, Bill, I think we can have all that development in an environmentally positive way. We're used to working in very sensitive environmental areas, but I read from that it could quite possibly be at the Commonwealth meeting of the heads of state that Western Australia and Queensland would be ordering champagne while the others drink beer. Is that sort of the scenario you can visualise?
Not so much, because we do have a thing called horizontal visual equalisation, basically where the Grants Commission tries to make sure that all Australians get a reasonable amount. So that's where the Grants Commission comes in and does that equalisation. But what we have the opportunity is to continue to grow wealth, so we have more opportunity for our residents and that going into the future. And that will be a driving force, rather than being able to sit like Tasmania on its backside and not do any development. Just hope that the money keeps rolling in from the mainland.
I think economic prosperity.
Yeah, I guess
in North
the
Queensland
point.
sorry, Phil. I was just about to say. I think economic prosperity in central and North Queensland would only end up in more expensive beer as opposed to changing to champagne. Just based on the... Sorry. Continue, mate.
Yeah, true story.
Continue, mate. Sorry.
No, that's true. It's getting back to that issue of industry. I know Tasmania are very, very environmentally conscious and very sensitive about their environment, but I'd like to add no more so than us in the Great Barrier Reef or the wet tropics. We're very, very sensitive about how development and how progress impacts on the environment. Regional Australia, regional Queensland, I think, are very conscious about how they conduct their particular business relative to environmental impact. And none of us want to see environmental impact. That's the very reason we live in these amazing parts of Australia. But I think it's important to also note that we can have a coexistence between sustainable development and a sustainable environment. So I guess that's where the state of North Queensland would certainly lead, or could lead, development and infrastructure development into the future.
And I guess to come full circle,
yes, I think
as well.
the environment.
Sorry, Bill, you go.
Yeah, I was just saying, yes, the environment's extremely important, and especially pristine areas. That's the thing that we've really got to be focused on. But I think what I was referring to, like in Tasmania and the Tamo Valley, is it wasn't a pristine area, and it had been already industrialised, and they were going to get a state-of-the-art paper mill, but they basically rejected it based on not real good information, more on emotion than those sort of things. So I think that's part of the issue. It's fine to protect the pristine environments and things like that, but there's got to be a little bit of common sense in regards to whether you're dealing with like an old forest or a new forest or a pristine forest and things like that. You can't just sort of saying, well, it's a tree, so therefore you can't do anything, or whatever. There's got to be some value between what you're protecting and what's the advantage of going ahead.
As Phil said, the sustainable development and the ecosystem can coexist, and if it's done accurately, it can be done to everybody's benefit as well as the environment. And it comes full circle, I was going to say, back to what we had. One of our original topics was the awarding of contracts to local specialised contractors that both know the implications of the work that they are undertaking, and that might specialise in the reduction of runoff with things like the Great Barrier Reef in mind. Where a contractor from South Australia, if they want a contract building roads up here, might not necessarily have those things in mind, and not to their detriment. It's just something that they'd never had to seriously consider, building roads in the Great Southern Bight. So it only comes, like I said, full circle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is Matt Maloney back? Matt, are you back with us yet, or are you still away from the phone?
I'm back, old boy.
Did you have a question that you wanted to ask Phil or bring to light?
Yeah, I did miss a little bit of the conversation. So if this ended up being covered, and I suspected it was heading in the way there, I do apologise for going back over the ground. But Phil, just how much of these, like in regards to these sort of like big civil engineering jobs, regards tendering process and everything, is it the case that it's purely done in regards to economics and it's just purely a sort of rationalist decision, or are political sort of, we need to give it to these people, I want to give it to my constituency, we want this to go to a Brisbane firm or whatever it is firm, are those sorts of considerations taken into account?
Look, I guess on a point of evidence, we do get a good open tendering process. We do see some anomalies or inconsistencies in the overall decision on the way some of these big projects are awarded. We do challenge those from time to time. What goes on behind closed doors, of course, we never really know about if that does or doesn't happen. I guess when you're awarding a $500 million project, under any circumstance, you have an absolute obligation to ensure that the process is clear and transparent. The process is in the best interests of all governments. I guess if that tends to narrow down the field of competition in tendering on those big projects, there's not a lot we can do about that, other than, of course, to break the projects down into smaller. So instead of a one single $50 million project, you might be able to break that down into two 25s or, three 15s and a 20 something. You might be able to break them down into smaller segments. That would come at a cost to the projects and to the government, because there's duplicity of service in administering and, controlling those projects. But it comes back to what's the government here for? The government's here, again, under the Constitution, to advance the lives of the people of Australia. So, are we really going to not consider the social and regional economic impacts of the way we do business as a government, as a federal or as a state government? We don't have the issue, of course, with local governments, because they don't often put out a $400 or $500 million project. But there's a lot of questions there. I don't believe I would have the answer to. But again, it comes down to, if we had the representation in our own right, I think we'd probably get to that a lot clearer through our political process.
Does that answer your question, Matt?
Indeed, it does. Thanks very much.
Well, gents, we've just passed an hour, and we should start trying to wrap things up. And I had a question that would be sort of vague in nature, but would be interesting to hear your response, Phil. Is what's a project that isn't necessarily in the pipeline at the moment that you, as a civil engineer, can see the economic benefit should it be implemented? Say the government was to release, I don't know, $100 million would seem to be a lot of civil works, but what's a project that you could adequately see, price aside, that would have great economic benefit for the decades to come, the future to come in general, that you would love to sink your teeth into?
Oh, the major transport routes up west and north. I think if we could get those major transport routes in, we're going to see small satellite, not cities, but small satellite communities, small satellite towns developing, because transport, it doesn't matter really. It does matter to some extent where you live, but not like you and I, where we drive into town every day to an office. The transport companies can, anywhere along the trade route, they could establish. So rather than pay exorbitant prices in Cairns or in the larger cities or wherever for depots and things like that, you imagine if they established a major transport route between here and Corumba and they set up a major transport hub, in one of those small cities out in the middle there, well, the economic benefits flow from here to that city, and from that it becomes an epicentre, I guess, in that particular region, that particular part of the state. And with that comes growth, with that comes settlement. You know, imagine a young couple who drive a truck and they can build a house for $300,000 on a couple of acres out in a regional area, as opposed to, you know, $500,000 for a tiny little block of land in a city where, you know, he can't really keep his truck, he can't really try and get ahead, he can't get that young family started. Whereas in those regions, you know, I think the economic opportunity right down for those people, and the suppliers, the mechanics, the fuel station, the local grocery stores, I think if those big, you know, transport routes were predominant and were opened up, I think growth would follow.
So in general, a north-south, east-west sort of spine along the whole central and North Queensland area to greatly boost economic diversity and the travel of the goods that we produce up here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Whether it's cattle, cane, seafood, whatever.
We also need to remember, too, the flow-on effects of, I mean, and this isn't a negative point at all, it's a positive, is that is one less family congesting the roads of south that would otherwise be in southeast Queensland. And the more prosperity that we give and access that we give to opportunity up in central North Queensland solves issues in southeast Queensland as well, does it not? Would you agree?
Oh, I do, and in fact, we could issue a passport for those wanting to come in here, and you know, we could attract the young families, we could attract the elderly that want to possibly move away from the big cities due to these pandemics and things that, you know, potentially could be coming. We've got kids up there that go to regional schools, and you know, they're probably more likely, and I say this is a bold, unqualified statement, but they're probably more likely to go motorbikes or horses, or rather than, you know, the electronic entertainment. I see lifestyle benefits in that. I see safety benefits for the older people. I see that, you know, they'd have opportunity to go afternoon strolls like they used to years ago. You know, the health benefits, the educational benefits, the economic benefits, I think, in my mind anyway, they can be unprecedented by doing that.
Oh, well, one more to follow up on that.
I don't want to hold us.
Let's go, Matt. Sorry, you go, mate. You go.
Yeah, so sorry, I don't mean to stretch it out, but this is a very informative conversation. Phil, in regards to something that's always kind of like from an economic point of view, something that I've always been really interested in. You know, there is this concept, especially from the Keynesians and from those on the left of the economic scale, this idea that if you just build something, even if there's not a high demand for it, and assume supply, so something is you'll get people there to come and fill that supply. Now, I suspect that does work with infrastructure, but having known quite a few small businesses that have failed, like, you know, this idea that just because you produce someone's going to consume it, it just doesn't work.
It's a field of dreams.
When it comes to infrastructure, yeah, exactly. If you build it, it will come. No, precisely. You know, you probably noticed I wrote that there before, but that really is that. Really, if you were going to oversimplify the Keynesian idea of, and going even further left than that, the idea that if you just produce something, people are going to consume it, and production is a good thing in itself, and it stimulates the economy, which kind of doesn't work really. But how do we tell? Like, is there any way of saying? Is it true to say that, like, if we just picked, and you know, this is purely a conversational thing, it's not Brisbane policy or anything. Well, let's just say we go, okay, well, we're going to create Charters Towers. Will be our new capital of the state, and we're going to build infrastructure in other areas around that just to stimulate that area. Will simply building infrastructure in an area sort of create things? Is there a law of diminishing returns? And if so, how can we tell so that we're not pouring money into something that's not going to work?
No, that's exactly right. But a magnet has no value. No, it does make perfect sense. It's a great comment. I guess it comes down to a magnet has no value if it has no steel. It's got nothing to attract. We would need to, we'd need to make it attractive. We'd need to have good transport routes. We'd need to have good water supply. We'd need to have local power, I guess, so that we ensure that all those industries are very, very competitive and very attractive for people to want to utilise that infrastructure. We'd stage that as the communities grew and try to develop that. I often wondered when they stopped building cars here in Australia, why we didn't say to Mr. Toyota or Mr. Honda or Mr. Nissan, look guys, let's make it easy for you. We've got a major highway here. Let's give you 500 acres of land. You come and build a factory and build your cars here. I don't know the whole story around that, but it's just a thought. If we had the power, the water, the people, the factory, the area, the room, the transport routes, would that open up an attraction for industry and for people in development to move to those areas?
Yeah, I've always wondered about, when does a great stimulus idea become a white elephant, and how do we tell the difference in the planning stages? I've got to be honest, that's something that's always kind of intrigued me.
I think it's intrigued a lot of engineers and a lot of town planners and a lot of, I guess, budget people along the way as well. I can't answer that. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Well, I think one of the things is actually we're so used to lagging growth. Like if you ever look around the place with roads and that, usually the population's gone well ahead of the infrastructure. There isn't too much we've built that is ahead of its time, if you know what I mean. We seem to be constantly lagging our needs or outgrowing them very quick, because I can remember things like the Southeastern Freeway in Melbourne when they first built that in the 80s. It was 2 lanes each way and it was going to be the bee's knees sort of thing. And within 5 years, they were already, we better increase it to 3 lanes each way. And the trouble is, they never allowed for that in the scale of things. And now they probably could have almost 8 lanes each way to service it. So I don't think you're ever going to have a situation where we're going to build infrastructure much ahead of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, quite possibly, Bill. That's right. We do see a lot of that infrastructure follow growth. You're right.
Well, I guess I wanted to follow up before Matt had that question. That was a brilliant question about the Field of Dreams scenario, where if the infrastructure was built in the concentrated area, how do we guarantee its economic prosperity? But to summarise it in a lot of different ways is based on one topic we touched on is as a head of an association and your access to representatives, both federal and state, in this central and North Queensland area, from the sort of projects that you see as being economically beneficial to the future of central and North Queensland, from the sort of projects and the way that tendering processes should be awarded to more specialised contractors like yourself, like other engineers, like the plumbers, like the carpenters in North Queensland, and understand the sustainable need to do things in a particular way more than any other South Queensland counterpart or any other state counterpart for that matter. Do you see any of these large-scale, economically beneficial projects happening under a current system easily, or could you see it happening significantly easier under the guise and under the leadership of a new state where there might be 25 representatives just in the area that decide on how things should be done and spent, or do you see a way for it to happen in the current status quo?
I think if we had a lot more representation in our own northern state, obviously we would get a closer contact between, I guess, for the want of a probably impolitically correct term, we'd get a better connect between the politicians behind closed doors and the working man. And I think we'd get a much closer understanding and empathy for your local and regional industries and business, far more than Canberra's 4,000 kilometres or something away. When you walk down the supermarket on Saturday morning, we would probably run into our senator. Now, do you think in all good conscience that senator would really not have the best interests of his region or his community in mind when he goes to Canberra, knowing that his kids play football on the weekend with my kids, or my wife sees his wife in the shopping centre? They're going to have a much more vested interest in their patch of land, as well as the overall, considerations of Australia if they're federal senators or federal members. But from a state point of view, my belief is that I think we'd have a much better connect. And I think by doing that, I think it's a much better representation for the people and the social and economic interests of those communities, more so than it would be now. Is it a challenge? I think the challenge would be significantly reduced if we had that representation for us compared to what we have today.
And that's a fantastic point, Phil, and it's something that we've always said about more localised representation for Central and North Queensland, is because not only are they more avidly do they remain longer in their constituency, they're more accountable as well. And it's something that I only look forward to should we hopefully have a referendum and gain the support of the Central and North Queensland residents to get a new state, have that ability, because it's far easier to ask somebody who's accountable day in, day out, whether it be the comment from somebody you run into at the supermarket, like you say, saying that was a dumb idea, or what the hell do you bloody think you're doing? And all those sort of things that you don't adequately get to do with the disparity that we currently have. So that was thank you for that answer. It was fantastic. Phil, is there anything you wanted as we finish, just to summarise your thoughts on getting better representation and the possibilities that could behold for Central and North Queensland when it comes to a civil engineer's perspective?
Obviously, the better representation we get, the better the consideration and the better the outcome for our region. I would like to note, though, that we do have, I think, great representation on all different coloured political shirts up here at the moment in North Queensland on all levels. The trouble is, it's a numbers game, isn't it? It's the majority rules, and unfortunately, when you've got such a heavy populace of representation in one particular area, being the southeast corner, it makes it extremely difficult. The key is numbers, and that's I guess the whole nuts and bolts of the story is we need to have those numbers. The only way we're going to get those numbers, obviously, is under our own steam.
Yes, fantastic thought. And yes, with the fantastic representatives we have up here, no one can take that away from them. We just wish that, some of us just wish they'd have more leadership in identifying the fact that they'd have a greater clout in whatever parliament they meet at, whether it's the federal parliament or the state parliament, the future state parliament, that is. That they'd have their wildest dreams would be far exceeded, in my opinion anyway, and the things that they could achieve should a new state happen for Central and North Queensland. Bill, did you have any finishing remarks before we wrap up tonight's show?
I think I just add there, adding to sort of Phil's comments in regards to our people are accountable to us, but the thing is, the 73 state politicians down in that southeast corner, well, they're accountable to their constituents, and they've got to operate on the premises they want to get re-elected and have to deliver for those constituents. So their constituents come first in their opinion, and we come a distant second, and that's just the truth of the matter. So until we can sort of cut those 73 politicians out of our system and have our own system, well, that's when we'll get ahead.
Mr. Maloney.
Oh, undoubtedly, Bill.
Mr. Maloney, did you have any finishing thoughts you'd like to contribute?
No, not really. It's all been covered. I'd like to thank Phil very much for taking time out of his taking time out of his very busy schedule to come and speak to us and enlighten us on this stuff and give us his perspective, mate. That was great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, well, if that's...
Thanks for having me, guys.
No, thanks for coming along tonight, Phil, and really appreciate your insight there from a civil engineer's perspective, and just to really so some of our listeners can understand just what the potential in Central North Queensland really is, and the great things that could be achieved should we have a more localised parliament. Thank you again, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Matthew, and if you're listening, you can follow Yes to a North Queensland State for a Facebook page to learn more and keep in up to date on all things referendum and constitutional law and the creation of new states for Central and North Queensland, a state for Central and North Queensland. Likewise, you can visit brisbane.com where you can learn more and see if there's any local forums or visits happening from any of the crew in your local area of North Queensland, and follow brisbane.com Facebook page and listen in next week, Wednesday 7 p.m. hopefully. So thanks very much and good evening, gentlemen.
Good night.
Good evening.
Good night.